When I first started baking at home, I wanted a loaf like this. I wanted this crust that was so crisp that it almost sounded glassy when I broke it. And I struggled with it. I couldn't figure it out. And then finally, I sort of unlocked it, and it all related to the use of a covered baker. Today, I'm going to show you how to introduce steam into the baking environment and to produce something that's as glossy and crisp and crackly as this. In order for me to show you how to make the crispiest, most blistered crust possible, we need a bread recipe. Today I'm going to make our pan de campagne. You've seen this bread before. We have a video for it. You've seen me shape it, mix it, bake it, the whole thing. That's a great recipe to use to practice your blistered crust. But the truth is that you can apply these techniques to almost any hearth bread that can be baked in a covered baker, right? Find your favorite hearth recipe and you can apply these methods. So let's mix the pan de campagne. This will be a little bit of a refresher. If you haven't made this bread, go ahead and check out that video. So let's get this mix going. And I want to say one thing about fermentation, and that is that for best results and most blistered crust, we need active fermentation. And so today I'm using starter, which is healthy. It was fed 12 hours ago. It's nice and bubbly. It's ready to go. I'm going to get the water into my 6-quart container. I'll add the sourdough culture, and then I'll add my flours and salt. I'll stir to combine. And then over the course of the first hour, I'll give it some folds. We have our pan de campagne. Now let's review for just a second. I used some active sourdough culture, I did the mix, and then I proceeded to folding. In an hour I gave 4 folds, and then the dough rose overnight. I divided it into 2 pieces, and I've done my pre-shape, and now it's time for the final shape. And I want to talk about what I've done or what I'm going to do for the baskets before we proceed. What I want to talk about as it relates to the basket is that I'm only going to use as light of a dusting of flour in the baskets as possible. And the reason for that is that if I apply a heavy coat of flour to the baskets, that flour will stick to the exterior of the loaf. And then when we get to the oven, the steam that we're going to work so hard to produce won't penetrate that thick crust in the same way and produce that blistered effect, right? So what I'm going to do is lightly flour these baskets. I want to be very mindful about what flour I'm using. So in order to use as little flour as possible, I have a blend which is about half rice flour, and then the other half is divided into white and wheat, right? So I have some rice flour, and then I have a little bit of white and a little bit of wheat. The rice flour does a great job of preventing the loaf from adhering to the basket. The one other thing that I would note is that I think it's better to use a Banneton liner. Use a cloth liner. You can go into the baskets, but because we're using so little dusting flour, you run a higher risk of the loaf adhering to the basket. So use a liner, dust lightly. Let's get these shaped. And one other note, just quickly, is that you want to keep this rice flour blend that you're going to use for dusting the baskets away from your shaping area. And the reason is that in the same way that that rice flour will prevent the loaf from sticking to the basket, it will also prevent the loaf from sticking to itself during shaping, which is something that we want, right? We want those seams to close, right? So don't use that rice flour blend for your bench flour. Keep it separate. I keep mine in a little container. It says rice or something like that on it. So let's see, I've got a boule and batard here, so I'm just going to shape this boule. You all have seen me do this, and just a reminder, we have a great video on this bread, pan de campagne. There's that, and then a batard. So you can see that this dough already has great activity. On the surface, there are already some bubbles. Good fermentation, right? Those bubbles are what, in a way, will become the blisters that we're looking for in the oven, right? So, good, healthy sourdough, ready for the basket, and ready to make some blisters if we can do the next steps well. Okay, 2 beautiful loaves, ready for the fridge. We'll cover them. The fridge is a key element for producing those blisters. That long cold fermentation is what gives us that blistered surface, in addition to the good fermentation that we started with and lots of steam at the oven. So cover them and chill them. Let's go. Okay, so we're to the baking portion of the show, and this is the crux for making a crust which has tons of blisters. What I'm doing is I'm using covered bakers, whether I am using a Challenger bread pan or whether I'm using this Emile Henry or the Broughton Taylor cover. All of those tools are going to enable me to create an environment during baking which has as much steam as possible. You may find that just baking in a pot is enough to produce the blisters. If it's not, what I'm going to show you is that I'll use a little bit of water down the side, and that will help produce a little bit extra steam. With the Broughton Taylor, I'll use ice, and also with the Challenger bread pan, I'll sneak some ice cubes in there. It's really at the inception of baking when I want maximum steam, and the ice, when it hits those hot preheated forms, immediately vaporizes, producing steam, and it clings to the surface of the loaf, producing the shine, producing the blisters, giving me that crunchy, crunchy crust that I want. This is a key phase, and it's very time dependent. You want to have all of your tools in place, right? So if you're going to drizzle a little bit of water into the baking pot after you load it, you want to have your water ready. Get your ice cubes ready. Get your oven mitts ready. These pots are very hot. We're preheating to 500 degrees, so you want to have a good set of mitts. You'll also want to have your lom at hand. You know, we want to be able to score those loaves, quickly get them into the pot, get the lids on, and then get them back into the oven, right? So get all your tools in place. One thing I like to use with this round pot is a sling. It's a dough sling. I put the loaf onto the sling, I score it, and then I just lower it in, and that remains in the pot during baking. With this tool, it helps you to put the loaf into the container without deforming it. I find that my scores, which I take time to make, they stay intact better when I'm holding it in a dough sling as opposed to kind of trying to chunk it into the pot or something. The one other thing that I would add is that you may see some methods for applying steam or trying to get more blisters, which involves spritzing or also painting the exterior of the loaf. Those can work, but they don't work as well as steam. And the reason that steam works so well is that steam is very hot. It transfers heat very well, right? So when we steam and that moisture immediately vaporizes and clings to the surface, it does a better job than if we just sort of squirt onto the surface of the loaf. The steam is emulating exactly how we do it in professional bakeries. So let's make some loaves. Hot, hot, hot. Okay. The way I get this out is I put the dough sling on there and then I just turn it over. And you can see I don't have a lot of extra flour on there, so I'm going to have a nice thin crust which blisters well. Go ahead and score. And we don't need to be fancy here. I'm just going to do a cross. You can add some little bit. And then I pick up the dough sling and I lower it into the pot. Whoop. Get my gloves back on. And I'm going to put about a tablespoon down the side right before I put the lid back on, right before I put the lid back on. And then get it in there. Okay, let's do that again. Let's load another one. This time, let's load the Challenger. Let's load the Challenger next. Okay, so I'm going to grab a Batard. We'll score it. We'll get it in there. We'll add some ice cubes. Bada bing, bada boom. We're baking. We're really baking here. And come on out. Be careful. So you can see this loaf does not have a lot of flour on it, right? It came out of there pretty nicely. I'm going to score it. Okay, I'm moving quickly because this pan is losing heat, and the whole point here is that I want to have these ice cubes immediately vaporize, right? So I like to get the pot a little bit close. Put a couple ice cubes in there, and then get the lid on. And back in. Okay, let me show you one more method for creating a covered baker if you don't have one. A lot of us have baking stones or steels, but you may not necessarily have something like a Challenger or even a Dutch oven. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this metal mixing bowl and I'm going to invert it over the loaf while baking, while still also introducing the ice cubes. I've got a round of parchment here. I'm gonna invert the loaf onto it. If you have a little bit of extra flour on there, this one looks like it got a little bit more flour than some of my other ones. I'm just gonna gently remove that, and then I'll score. And we'll go over to the oven. Pull this out. So I'm gonna pull it out, get my loaf on there, a couple ice cubes. And then get everybody underneath there. Best you can. Okay, it's like bread Christmas. Every time you take the lid off one of these things, it's like, woo, see what's happening. Ooh, see that shine? That's what we want. Put it back in for another 15, 20. Bake it to the color you like. It's done when you say it's done. That's my rule with baking. It's done when you say it's done. I don't care about the thermometer. When I look at it, I want to see beauty. I want to see something that's appetizing. That's how I know it's done. It's done when I say it's done. Turn the light on and sit here and watch it. Play some soft music and we'll just sit here and sort of watch our bread bake. You can see on the sidewalls here, look at the shine. So that shine relates to steam, and the steam does some other things too, beyond just making a nice thin, beautiful, crackly crust. It also helps the loaf to color because the Maillard reaction happens better when you have a moist crust. So the loaf browns better in a moist environment. So you get better expansion, you get a thinner, crisper crust, you get a beautiful dark color on the loaf. Those are the things that are sort of enabled through good steam. So, beautiful loaves, beautiful bread. I'm happy with that. So if you've been on the fence about getting a covered baker, let this be proof that you should do it, right? Using a covered baker allows you, the baker, to steam in a much more thorough fashion. You can introduce a lot more water into the bake chamber during baking, the result of which is beautiful crust crispness and thinness. You get these nice blisters, you get better loaf expansion, and you get better color. So this is our pan de campagne recipe. I hope you enjoyed these tricks for how to introduce steam and get the most blistered thin crust you can make. Thanks for joining us today, and stay tuned for more great content.